So I'll be presenting on the British middle school tonight, which includes more than Fairbairn, Guntrip, and Winnicott, but those are the three theoreticians that I'll be focusing on. I mean, you'll see when I get to just starting with Winnicott, the slide on kind of key papers and concepts. The slide is like, I almost thought about bringing down my collected volumes tonight and just setting it down and saying, this is what I can't cover in an hour. So take with a grain of salt, this will be cursory. What I've tried to do is to link it to two things. One is to situate the British middle school within the context of psychoanalysis at the time and what was called the controversial discussions or the Freud-Klein controversy. And the reason this is important, I think, is because part of the spirit of the British middle school is of independent thought and integration, which is so core to what we do here at Riggs as well. So the other theme, and where I'll end, is I'm hoping to highlight aspects of the theoretical formulations of each of these three analysts in relation to the work that we do at Riggs. And it's a really grandiose ambition to have any time left for discussion, but I hope to have time left for discussion so we can also think together about where this comes up in our work with our patients, where these concepts, different theoretical ideas are useful. And I also, this is really going to be an experiment. I don't know if my voice is going to last. I'm going to try to have it last as best as I can. John graciously volunteered to just suck up airtime and talk if I lose my voice. We'll see what we have to do. Okay, so let me get into it. So I'm going to start just by framing things in terms of the controversial discussions and what that is. Just show of hands, does anyone know what those are? Oh, I mean, you two are. It's a useful context as we get into all three of these people. I'll be going in order of girth of the presentation. So Winnicott's is the girthiest, Fairbairn a little less so, Guntrip even less so. Not because necessarily, certainly not in importance in my mind. I'm most affectionate towards Fairbairn. But Winnicott, probably just in terms of someone who's so often cited, quoted within various areas within the institution, evoked in different ways. Something that distinguishes Winnicott from Fairbairn and Guntrip is Winnicott never developed, his own comprehensive metapsychological structure. And this, I think, was in line with something, a quote I'll share later in the presentation, as he said something about writing from a creative heart rather than a librarian's mind. Mm-hmm. And himself would talk about the way in which he probably hadn't read as much Freud as he should have or knew it well enough. But he wasn't a synthesizer in that way. He was a prolific clinician and worked in so many settings and in so many contexts, first as a pediatrician and then in his analytic training and practice. His patients were his greatest teachers. And so his writing and his theories develop along those lines. You can see them in conversation with the controversial discussions and also with other analysts in England at the time. But in part, summarizing him is long because it's harder to encapsulate it in a metapsychological theory. Fairbairn is different, and Guntrip as well. And then, like I said, I'll leave some room for us to talk at the end. So the controversial discussions were a series of meetings within the British Psychoanalytical Society, primarily between 1941 and 1945. And just to say, I'll be plugging read more throughout the course of this, because if anything catches your interest, there's so much more you can read about, both theoretical papers, but also the history, which I find fascinating to frame this all. Pearl King has an excellent book, The Freud-Klein Controversies, which goes through meeting by meeting, kind of the history of these discussions, what the points of tension were, which were incredibly valuable if you're interested in learning more. Phyllis Grosskirth also has an amazing biography of Klein, which touches on so much of the material tonight, and it's worth knowing. But the basic summation is, prior to the immigration of Sigmund and Anna Freud following the Nazi occupation and their move into Britain, Ernest Jones was kind of in charge, and the heir apparent to psychoanalysis and innovation and thinking, in addition, was Melanie Klein. And I think she was there for about 12 years or so, kind of really running the show, clinical innovation, before the immigration of Anna Freud. and Sigmund Freud. And this brought attention then, because you have the princess of psychoanalysis in Anna Freud with her father coming in, and you have Klein's innovations and some significant theoretical distinctions between the two. The nature of infantile fantasy, the timetable for the Oedipal complex. This is all, I won't go into it because Ed already gave his presentation on Klein, and I'm sure it summarized most of this, but it created a real encampment in the British psychoanalytical around who was aligned with who. And if you've been in an institute, there are then implications for training and what qualifies for this and who's a training analyst and what classes do you take and who do, and it's fascinating where they end up, but that's a little beside the point. The point for tonight's presentation is that there was a group that situated themselves in the middle, hence the middle school. These were people who had either independent thought or a vested interest in integrating or learning from both Anna Freud and from Melanie Klein, or for other complicated reasons, were finding themselves not wanting to align too strongly. Now, with Winnicott and Fairbairn, I'll say some about the context. Winnicott's is particularly painful, and we'll get into that in a moment. But this is what the controversial discussions were. So Winnicott, Donald Woods Winnicott, 1896 to 1971. I'll start with some psychobiographical context. I am sure this is going to feel like more biographical information than you want, but it's so rich and so important, I think, to understand the unfolding of his theory. This is the other thing that I hope is impressed upon everyone attending these introductory lectures. You cannot possibly separate the theory of the individual from the life they lived, the families they were in, the training they underwent. And it is the same for all of us. And as the director of training, one of my greatest joys is watching the various kind of theoretical minds of our fellows evolve, both as they get to know themselves better in their training analyses and as they both painfully and hopefully enlighteningly get to see themselves mirrored back to them from the staff here in the training. So you are shaped by your biography. None of these people are exceptions to that. So Winnicott was born the youngest child of his parents. He had two older sisters. And lived in a restful upper middle class family in the town of Plymouth. His name derived from the old Celtic word meant mighty, which is quite something to live up to. And his father and uncle both were very invested in the family business, which Winnicott's grandfather had started, Winnicott Brothers Merchant and Shippers. His father was also very active in local politics. He was twice elected mayor. He aspired to be a part of parliament, but had a learning disability and felt not capable of doing it. But between business and his involvement in the church and other things, he wasn't around much. So Winnicott grew up in a house full of women, sisters, nannies. The other thing that's interesting is, if you were really wealthy back then, you had male servants, you had butlers, you had, and they weren't that wealthy. So all of the people that worked for them were women. In this home, there was an aunt that lived with him. There was Donald's nanny, Allie, who he remained close with for 50 years. There was a governess for the elder sisters, a cook and several parlor maids, and a luxurious, it sounds like, living environment. So he had multiple mothers, as he referred to them. And by the way, most of this biographical information comes from Brett Carr's biography of Winnicott, which is brief. You can read it in a weekend, and it's wonderful. So he, within this context, had a deep interest in the world of mothers and an identification with women. And the one gift that his father gave him that he reflected upon was a free-spirited mind. His father, despite being really invested in the Wesleyan Church, told him, read the Bible yourself, make up your own mind. I don't need you to think what I think, but I need you to read and think for yourself. And so it's not surprising, I think, then that this is, a part of who he is as he goes on in his career. But this all was not uncomplicated. Winnicott's mother was very depressed. This is a poem that he wrote about her. It's quoted in Adam Phillips's biography, Mother below weeping, weeping, thus I knew her, once stretched out on her lap and now on dead tree. I learned to make her smile, to stem her tears, to undo her guilt, to cure her inward death, to enliven her was my fate. How do you not see something about his later writing and theoretical exploration of true and false self, of the maternal environment? Hold this in mind as we go through this discussion. But it's not a far stretch, I think, to make the interpretive move that a lot of his biographers make in saying that so much of his kind of professional aspiration probably had to do with fantasies of rescuing others or rescuing women. And this was both in his personal life with his mother, but also in his very troubled marriage, which I'll talk about in his first marriage. So he goes to boarding school, matriculated to Cambridge, and then enrolled in the Navy, where he served as a surgeon probationer. The purpose of that is to have a sole medical officer on a destroyer, just someone that the sailors' mothers would feel safe knowing there was a medical professional there, but he hadn't completed medical training at that point. He then matriculated to the Medical School of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. And he noticed around this time, following serving in the war, that he had a prolific dream life prior to the war, and afterwards he had stopped dreaming. And this troubled him, and he went to a local bookseller and started to ask for books on dreams, and after a couple books found his way to Freud and started reading Freud. And this then sparked his interest in psychoanalysis, which was kind of the start of the journey for him. He graduated as a licensed medical doctor in 1920 and took up two positions, one at Queen's Hospital for children in Hackney and Paddington Greens. And he maintained a relationship with Paddington Green for 40 years after that in various ways. It was also around this time that he married Alice Buxton Taylor. She was 31 years old, 4 years his senior. And the marriage lasted for 25 years, but she was deeply, deeply troubled, had hallucinatory and delusional material in her experience. And in fact, he pursued trying to get her into analysis first, which was another way that he was introduced into the world of the British psychoanalytic. The two remained married and were not separated until 1949. By that time, he'd met his second wife, and most people agree that they had started a romance and he had to extricate himself from a very painful marriage. So he referred with consultation to Ernest Jones. He was referred to treatment with James Strachey, his first analysis, which lasted about 10 years. Winnicott himself described himself during this time as quite ill. This is one of the painful bits of his history. Alex and James Strachey, Alex's wife, had loose lips. And James was known for talking openly about Winnicott's analysis. And in fact, it seeped out into the British psychoanalytic, where it became common knowledge that he was impotent and had great sexual problem. And there were letters that were later published where Alex basically said things like, has Winnicott just fucked his wife yet? I mean, this was the kind of boundaryless setting. And it got really ugly within the context of the controversial discussions, because these sorts of things would be levied as insults in the meetings. Now, despite all of this, he found the analysis, although incomplete, very helpful. And in fact, probably in part stabilizing during a very troubled marriage. In 1927, he enrolled as a candidate in the Institute of Psychoanalysis in London. And later, he qualified as the first male child analyst in Britain. Now, Strachey suggested that Winnicott familiarize himself with Melanie Klein, given his interest in children. And he met with her shortly thereafter his mother's death. Initially, he wanted to pursue another analysis with her, but she said no, because she wanted him to analyze her son, Eric. And not only that, she wanted to supervise the case. Now, Winnicott had enough sense about him to push back and refuse on that, but he did treat her son. But he pursued supervision of other cases. And this lasted from 1935 to 1941. He then underwent a second training analysis with Joan Riviere, and who herself was analyzed by Ernst Jones and then Freud. She was known as a bully among her colleagues, and would speak publicly and critically about Winnicott at meetings. He just makes theories out of his own sickness in reference to his conflicts with his mother. And her hostility grew the more and more he broke with Klein. And I'll say something in relation to his theoretical development, but the clearer it was, he was turning attention to the external world of the infant in addition to the intrapsychic world. This became untenable, and it started to get ugly. In 1935 or 34, he qualified as an adult analyst, and in 35 got his certification in child analysis. And by 36 was a full member of the British Psychoanalytic, with his Manic Defense paper being the presenting membership paper. And then finally in 40, qualified as a training analyst. This is a picture from Grosskurth's biography of Melanie Klein. This was her 70th birthday party. And I know I'm being videotaped, but I'm going to stand up for a second just to highlight something. So here's Winnicott, and here is Joan Riviere. And she was known for kind of towering over him. I mean, he was a little shorter in stature and she's hunched over there, but she was an imposing figure There are some other maybe familiar faces. Ballant, Strachey, Klein over there. But it was tumultuous, and Winnicott himself struggled a great deal, both in terms of his identification with women, but also how he was perceived. Have any of you ever heard an audio recording of Winnicott speaking? It's amazing. There's a famous anecdote that he used to call Harry Carnac, Carnac books, the original books for psychoanalysis. And Carnac would reply, "How may I help you, madam?" His voice was so high. And he did a very famous series of lectures for the British radio, meant to speak to the public about mothering and parenting. And people would write letters into the BBC for Mrs. Winnicott. And so, you think about that, how emasculated he was by the comments around his impotence, and his standing being constantly challenged and denigrated. By the end, Melanie Klein referred to him as that awful man. So he was up against it. So finding his own voice, he pivoted from enviousness, aggressiveness, and greediness and psychotic experience towards infants as healthful, needy, and wishing to be loved as kind of the primary experience. As I quoted earlier, the heart of a clinician rather than the mind of a library student. And he really emphasized learning from his patients. In fact, the dedication and playing in reality, his collected work, is to my patients who have paid to teach me. And lastly, a huge influence on his thinking, which I'll articulate as we walk through some of his key contributions and papers, is his work caring for displaced youth during the war effort. He wrote adamantly and advocated for children not to be removed from their homes because what he anticipated would be the damage done by this experience. And in the middle of it, working in youth hostels, he would at times take kids into his home to be cared for. And this was complicated because he was still working an enormous amount, and I think in part was escaping his tumultuous marriage by working. So his wife, who was deeply troubled, was the one who was left at home to care for these really troubled youth. So it was a tumultuous thing. And if you read Hate and the Countertransference with that in mind, it takes on a whole kind of other light. But these were some of his influences. Lastly, this is the last bit of biography, then I'll get into his theory. He met Claire Britton when working with evacuated children. She's a social worker. And after his divorce, they married not long afterwards. She trained as an analyst and was analyzed first by Clifford Scott, who had analyzed Winnicott's first wife, another boundary issue. And then she was analyzed by Melanie Klein, who could not stand her. And in fact, Winnicott had to mediate between the two of them to get Melanie Klein to take her back into analysis and to graduate her from her training analysis. Another famous anecdote is Klein offered a 25-minute nonstop interpretation of one of Claire's dreams, to which Claire said, "How dare you take my dream and serve it up to me?" And she got up and stormed out of the office. And Klein almost didn't take her back. But this sort of character, this powerful character, was also a part of a collaboration in a marriage which was much healthier than his first marriage. And in fact, his writing takes off around this time. And she is so much in his thinking and in his contributions to his work. And she passed away in 71, or he passed away, sorry, in 71, following a period of heart attacks and declining health, but to his dying day, writing and thinking. Okay, like I said, long list. This could easily be much longer, but these are some of his seminal papers in chronological order. And in fact, many of them then get brought into collected works like Playing in Reality. If you have the time, we spent a couple of years ago, we did a lunch group, a reading group, Megan Colano and I and some others, where we just read through his entire collected papers one at a time at a lunch meeting. It was lovely. It's so worth it. And we have the collected works up in our library if you're interested. But these are the major works. Let's walk through them a little bit. So I've tried to break these down into periods of time, core concepts or ideas that emerge. Cartoonish is right. This is so cursory. Winnicott is deceptively dense. For those of you who attended Stephen Cooper's teaching, he has invested in one aspect of it, which is thinking about Winnicott's notion of play. And you listen to Stephen talk and his own wrestling with it and uncertainty about it, and you read Winnicott. It's not simple stuff. It's deceptively simple. So, of course, we can go into a lot with any of these. So key concepts. during the early work was clinical observations and a move towards the environment, the external real environment. As he was a pediatrician, he was taught, not by psychoanalysts or psychiatrists, but by about some of his closest kind of attending physicians and mentors about the value of listening and of knowing something about the person's history beyond just symptom checklists. And this fascinated him, and he started to take into account the environments in which children were being raised, especially maternal care and emotional development, which was contrast with the dominant Freudian drive model at the time. And core ideas emerging through a lot of these interviews and works in pediatrics were about the mother's adaptation to the infant's needs. This is before his concept of a good enough mother. It's kind of proto good enough mother, but that there's a necessary adaptation within the dyad, and that early forms of holding and handling are the foundations of ego development, literal holding and handling as well as emotional holding and handling. His first major work is Clinical Notes on Disorders of Childhood during this time. And then also you can see, and it still is a great paper for anyone interested in early relational health, the observation of infants in a set situation, thinking about how to watch the holding and handling unfold. So as he's moving on from pediatrics and into his analytic training, he starts to flesh out some of these ideas, including the notion of a good enough mother, meaning that there's a sort of responsiveness that allows the infant to build, one, a continuous sense of self and to go along being, but it is not an idea of perfection. And in fact, good enough has built into it repetitive failures, which are important in terms of learning something about the reality of the other as separate and about rupture and repair within the relationship. The holding environment then is a matrix of physical and emotional care enabling early ego integration. This, by the way, is going to be a significant breaking point between the thinking of Fairbairn and Winnicott. Fairbairn has this interesting idea about a pristine ego at birth that then pieces of it get shorn off in relation to problematic object relations. Whereas Winnicott, there's a putting together of pieces and an integration of the ego that happens within the context of the holding environment. I had to give this paper its own ridiculously long slide. I had to. I tried to chat GPT it down. I couldn't chat GPT. I had to leave it. It was Hate in the Countertransference is a paper that I just like everyone who works here needs to read over and over again and return to. This is a paper that's born out of some of his experiences with his earliest patients who challenged him. One of the kids that he took into his home literally bit him on the ass. And of course, one can imagine the hate that engenders. And so as he's wrestling with kind of the climate at the time, which was still quite prohibitive around countertransference. Countertransference was still something bad. We take for granted how much we appreciate it and use it as an instrument in our work. That was not always the case. And a special component of this was just realizing that just like in mother-infant relationships, there's an expectable amount of both love and hate, that they both exist. And in fact, being able to tolerate this and to make use of it and to titrate it is also something that translates into the therapeutic relationship. And in fact, the patients are unconsciously testing whether objects can survive their destructiveness, our ability to hold limits, to be in touch with our own hate, to say no. He gives a lot of examples of how this is done in the analytic hour, whether it's the end of the hour or charging a fee. You might not think about that as hate, but it's an expression of our own kind of limits and need apart from just boundless love. And that there's an emphasis within this of a management of our own kind of feelings of countertransference within the frame before interpretation. And this is often something that Winnicott will return to as kind of both the importance but the limited value of interpretation as something secondary to consistency within the relationship itself and the holding frame. He also, and I think this is, we can get to this when we have our discussion about our work here, but a sort of ethical stance around honesty. Both the analyst's honesty within themselves about their own hate, whether it's privately in supervision, in reflection or training analysis, but a willingness to acknowledge it rather than to push it underground where it can't be made use of. And I would also argue, ideally, too, a way to make use of it, not just privately, but also in the therapeutic work. Then we get to his writing about transitional objects and transitional phenomena, which is transitional objects is probably the thing in popular psychology or culture that he's most well known for. And of course, his most famous paper with this being transitional objects and their phenomena. But there's a turning point here where he starts to articulate how infants in particular might use objects like blankets or toys as a bridge between inner and outer reality. And he introduces the notion of potential space, which then gets further elaborated in his ideas about play and about the use of therapy to be a spot between subjective and objective reality, a place for creativity and integration, and maybe in the more kind of modern language of mentalization treatment or other kind of developmental models, a sort of as if space where things can be worked at in the space between self and me and not me, which is a developmental achievement. In the mid to late 1950s, he then shifts and he writes this paper at the end of the 1950s, going to the 60s, Ego Distortion in Terms of True and False Self. And he introduces the notion of a true self which emerges when an environment supports spontaneous gesture. You know, the point of congruence between a mother which can meet the child well enough around who they are temperamentally and constitutionally without demanding too much adjustment, versus a false self when an infant feels they must comply with external demands. The family that needs them to be a certain way to be a part of the family culture. Anger is not tolerable, so anger cannot exist. He's starting to articulate the cost of adaptations, on the one hand, which are adaptive, to feel safe and claimed by one's family, to have an environment in which one feels they have membership, but the cost of that being the burying of a sort of more congruent sense of self. The Antisocial Tendency then is written also around this time, and he frames in a way children in particular and their acting out. And if you read this paper, it's actually kind of directed towards parents in a way, because some of the frame for the paper is his consultation to a mother where he's basically can't see the child in treatment, but can see her briefly for consultation. And he teaches her in this remarkable way how to translate the acting out behavior into something meaningful. And the conclusions that he draws, that he highlights in the Antisocial Tendency, is there's actually something of hope in acting out. And he distinguishes between acting out that comes from privation or deprivation. Privation is when there's no good experience that was ever there. Chronic neglect, hopelessness, psychopathy kind of are born from this. Whereas with deprivation, there's loss. And he frames certain behaviors like stealing or destructiveness as efforts to test an environment in which there's some hope that something could be recovered, you know, coming from a place of deprivation, or something can be survived in the destructiveness. It's a wonderful paper in terms of what it lends us to thinking about the sort of acting out that we can find ourselves in with our patients here in this setting, but also a kind of a brilliant consultation to parents, which is what he was really known for. Then in the 50s and 60s, we get into play and potential space further. He extends his ideas from infant development to the therapeutic encounter, both with children and with adults, and play as a medium for growth, creativity, and healing in both children and adults. Play and reality being the work that really summarized this and was published posthumously. Object use and object destruction. I'm already fretting because we're a half an hour in. This is just the worst. No one warned me. Everyone warned me. In his writing, he distinguishes between relating to and using an object. And in his paper, The Use of an Object and Relating Through Identifications, he distinguishes the way in which infants need to be able to destroy something in fantasy and discover its survival to recognize it as truly external from oneself. This you can think about too, that earlier paper, 8 in the Countertransference, 47. Now we're 22 years later. And it's coming a bit full circle in terms of the importance of that sort of hateful and aggressive encounter and the need for the child to see someone survive it so that their own fantasy about their destructiveness, and you can also see Klein's influence in this writing, their destructiveness doesn't actually destroy the external object. And it again serves a developmental purpose in terms of locating the other as an object outside of the self. We talk about this, and you may hear people talk about it here all the time in terms of surviving our patients' attacks and their fantasies about their destructiveness and what it will do to us. Okay, I made it to Fairbairn. That's pretty good. Winnicott in half an hour. He's rolling over in his grave.
While standing on one leg.
I'll stand up, yeah, or with half a voice. All right, Fairbairn. Fairbairn's my favorite. We had a guinea pig actually named after him. He was untimely murdered by our dog. It was buried in our backyard, but we had a guinea pig named Fairbairn. All right. Fairbairn's a little bit difficult and different. He's difficult. He's different. People say Fairbairn's writings are difficult. I can't wait to teach a class on him again because I actually find his writing really coherent. I don't think it's technical maybe, but in some ways I find him more accessible than Winnicott. Maybe I'm weird and alone in that. But he's also very different in his background. So Fairbairn was born in Scotland in 1889. He was an only child of middle-class parents who were equal parts demanding and restrictive. There was a strong Calvinist influence in the household. On his father's side and his mother's side, more conservative Presbyterianism. His mother was very rigid and over-involved by his report, sometimes supportive of his strivings if they aligned with her view of who he should be, but also incredibly frightening at other times with how punishing she could be. And anyone who's interested in Fairbairn, there's a wonderful biography of him written by Sutherland called Into the Interior, which is terrific. And Sutherland was someone who studied with Fairbairn and another, kind of develops ideas of his later on. His father was negativistic, punitive, and also competitive with Fairbairn, which created a challenging home environment. Now, Fairbairn then becomes known for these split parts of the ego, the anti-libidinal ego, or the rejecting object, and the exciting object. And you look at this early familial constellation, which at times was supportive and enticing, but also punishing. And you can imagine then how these ideas were, in him from early on. When it came time for university, his father didn't want to pay for him to study at Oxford, in part because of competitive dynamics, and instead insisted that he stay closer to home at Edinburgh University. His mother really wanted him to pursue a career of the mind, while his father wanted to prevent him from being exposed to liberal religious thought. And so there was a tension within the household around this. He graduated in 1911 with a degree in philosophy and decided to become a clergyman, in part because his father felt this would be sustainable and not too egregious, and also his mother was okay enough with it. But before he enrolled in divinity school, he studied Hellenic culture and took an intermediate degree at London University before returning. Now, he had enrolled to become a Presbyterian minister. He was just on the precipice of it when the First World War broke out. And he had a very strong sense of patriotism and wanted to enlist, but the church and his parents kind of got in the way, and his mother in particular really wanted to keep him close to home. So as a compromise, he joined the engineering unit of the University Officers Training Corps. The exposure of this to the war and the war effort in ways, I think, similarly that, Winnicott was not serving on the front line in quite the same way when he was in the Navy, maybe more akin to Bion's experiences. Consulting, but he was really impressed upon watching people treat shell shock and became much more interested in psychology throughout these experiences. In the autumn of 1917, he was promoted to a lieutenant, and his battery was shipped off to the Middle East. He saw more action there, and upon discharge, he decided this is the career I want to pursue, and he went to medical school beginning in 1918. During this time, he was reading Freud and Jung, and in 1921, he underwent a personal analysis with E.H. Connell, who was a wealthy businessman who had been analyzed by Ernest Jones. Anyone know who that is? Yeah, exactly.
Never heard of him.
Yeah, in part, he's kind of a nobody in psychoanalysis, but Fairbairn, and for most of his career, stays in Scotland. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of training analysts. There wasn't a lot of resources there. So he did this one kind of unsatisfying training analysis by his report. And then he did two personal self-analyses at different points in his career, which sounds a bit crazy, but if he's reading Freud, that was Freud's model. Freud did his self-analysis. Fairbairn's going to do his self-analysis. But he, through this process, realized how profoundly limited it was. You need transference, he said, for it to be something that motivates the overcoming of resistance, doing it on your own. He felt, so I think his own experience of a training analysis was unsatisfactory across the board. He graduated from med school in 23 and briefly worked in general practice. But shortly thereafter, when his father died, he seems to have felt a sense of freedom. He didn't seem to grieve much, and this opened up something in him, especially as his mother moved into a new home and joined the Anglican Church. So he started to see psychotherapy patients in 1925 and pursuing his own writing and thinking. He briefly considered moving to London and working at the Tavistock, but it wasn't really financially viable at that point. And he was rejected, by the way, I think, when he had applied. So he took up 2 posts in Scotland, working with terminally ill patients in Edinburgh, and another one teaching the psychology department at the university, where they could not stand his psychoanalytic ideas. It was a constant battle with the department chair. When he was 37, he married Mary Gordon, who came from an old Scottish family. She was much younger than him, and they quite quickly had 3 children. His eldest daughter, Eleanor, was born in 27, and he first wrote his first clinical paper then his sons Cosmo and Nicholas thereafter. There's a pattern here with the middle school. This was an awful first marriage. It was really problematic. His wife was terribly alcoholic, and it strained him greatly, and in some ways kind of prohibited him from moving more towards London and being more involved there. He took great care of her, but it was a painful experience. And in fact, eventually, she died from an overdose of aspirin and sought medical help too late. It's unclear whether it was a suicide or not. But she died from multiple organ failure, which was exacerbated by her alcoholism. And not long after her passing, which was in 52, he married his second wife, Marion Frances Mackintosh, which was a satisfying marriage. So he was conversant with general psychology and their views on fear, flight or fight responses. And he was willing to look for parsimonious solutions and consider non-analytic perspectives, which already was placing him, as he was engaging more with the British psychoanalytical, a little outside the bounds in the same way that John Bowlby was. Bowlby was in training there. I didn't share this anecdote. I have to share this. I know we're pressed for time. During the controversial discussions, Bowlby had the unfortunate task of driving both Melanie Klein and Anna Freud home at the same time. And neither one of them would concede the back seat, because to sit in the front would be to give up superiority. So they both sat in the back seat. Bowlby drove them home in silence. Neither said a word. And he was mortified. And he's another person who, he got the criticism even worse than Winnicott and the awful things that they would say about him. So much like Bowlby, who was conversant in ethology and all sorts of other things, and a bit more expansive in his thought, given his context in an academic department, his willingness to work towards integration, he was doing this. He applied to head the new child clinic at the Tavistock, was denied, and was introduced by an analyst at the time, Ernest Jones, or introduced by his analyst to Ernest Jones and Glover. And it was Glover who first invited him to give a paper presentation of the British Psychoanalytic, which was a paper on the feature in the analysis of a patient with a genital abnormality was the title of the paper. So he has one book, his collected volume. He has about 5 papers that outline the evolution of his thinking in terms of his metapsychology, and then he has some just general clinical papers in it. I find those interesting, but much less interesting than the sequence of his metapsychology. But this paper earned him membership. And when he went back to his department, he was so excited and brought some of Melanie Klein's ideas, and the department had read a little bit of Klein and said, I can't take this. This woman writes like the Book of Revelation, and didn't want to hear any more about the British psychoanalytical ideas that Fairbairn was bringing back to the psychology department. So his major works, Winnicott, volumes, Fairbairn, this book, Psychoanalytic Studies of the Personality, contains all of his writing, basically. All of his clinical writing. It is a wonderful book. It is worth the read. It's edited by David Scharf. If you look at the elaborations of Fairbairn's theory, which really hasn't been taken up very broadly, Fairbairn is still alien to a lot of people. The Scharfs have done an enormous amount of work thinking about him in terms of his contribution to object relations theory, in part also in relation to their work with families and couples, because as we talk about his theory, it really is thinking about how internal object relations relate in the transference or in relationships to kind of other people, the different hooks that we have that get enacted. My first exposure to Fairbairn was working in a domestic violence program where the question over and over was, why do these people return to their violent partners? Well, this is a question that Fairbairn takes up. Why do children stay connected to their violent and abusive parents? So early on, one of his first dissatisfactions was a pivot from the idea of people being primarily pleasure seeking in a drive, or attention reduction seeking from the drive model, to object seeking. This was his first and adamant challenge within the British psychoanalytical, is that people are inherently object seeking. And he would get into many arguments about this, but his argument was that the libido is aimed at people from the very start, that there's something about the need for relatedness from infancy that was inherent. And he continued to have this growing critique of classical libido theory and treating symptoms as excess energy. And rather, he started to think about symptom formation as a disruption of these early object relationships and object seeking. So the emphasis really early on and in his early papers, in the first one in this series being Schizoid Factors in the Personality, is moving towards what happens in the disruptions in those early relationships that can precipitate a move inward into a schizoid or split position. And in fact, when he uses the word schizoid, I think we think about kind of schizoid personality, but he's really talking about splits, schizoid splits within the ego structure that he's starting to notice when people are failed by the early environments of care. This then gets elaborated in his paper, Revised Psychopathology of the Psychoses and Psychoneuroses, where he starts to think in terms of relations rather than conflicts. So symptoms now, he says, are adaptations to failed or frustrating object relations. And development stalls when the child must relate to an unsatisfying or rejecting caregiver. We still are not at the point yet in his theory where he has his endopsychic structure, rejecting an exciting object, but he's building to it in his theorizing. He then comes to this question, which was my first exposure to him, which is, why do we remain attached to bad objects? The things that come out of this paper, the repression and the return of bad objects, are really, I think, important and very alive in the work we do with our patients. So the central question is, why do children cling to painful relationships? Well, one explanation he comes to is what he calls the moral defense, meaning that, and the famous quote from the paper is, it's better to be a sinner ruled in a world ruled by a benevolent God than to be a saint ruled in the world by the devil. There's something incredibly powerless if you're a helpless infant with a punishing, rejecting parent. If you're able to change that in your mind where you're the bad one, there's some hope yet that you can adjust yourself in a way to be accepted or cared for in the way that you want. And he calls this the moral defense. It's my badness, not yours. And guilt and self-blame then become the thing that preserve attachment. Anyone who's worked with domestic violence, this is like an incredibly familiar scenario, or with children who have been neglected or abused. He then starts to talk about how there's an internalization of this bad object. It's not the external person, but it's kind of an internal split off object relation that gets internalized and related to, that preserves the real external parent's goodness. Here again, too, you see him paying credit to, like the middle school comes to be known for, both the importance of the internal world and internal objects, but the reality of the external world and external relationships. This then sets up the logic for his later structural splitting of the ego model that comes. And this comes with endopsychic structure. What a wonderfully jargony way of talking about one's internal world. So this is a structural model that's built out of relationships. I don't have it on this slide, but the language he used that he talks about it is really fascinating and challenging. And if we have time, we could debate it or talk about it. But his argument is that there's a pristine ego at birth. There is an already integrated enough sense of self. And what happens then is that the immediate exposure to the environment necessitates kind of, he calls it a shoring off of parts of the self. Now, this is it's a normative process. It's part of adaptation to the external environment. But with abusive or neglectful parenting, or with those who are too exciting and imposing of their own needs and desires. There are bits and pieces of the self that are larger, that get shorn off and then internalized, both as split off object relations and split off parts of the ego. So there's two corresponding things that get split off in either direction he talks about. One is a libidinal ego, which is related to and in conversation internally with the exciting object. The other is an anti-libidinal ego, or what he later calls the internal saboteur, which is kind of the self-destructive, self-blaming part, which is in relation to a rejecting or punishing object. So this constellation of split off internalized objects for him is the thing that becomes a closed internal system which generates psychopathology and disrupted relationships. People come to treatment then when they're inhibited in healthful lives because of these constellations. Then lastly, towards the end of his writing, he tries to unify in his paper, Object Relationships and Dynamic Structure, a summary of his thinking that unifies motivation for the reasons that these things would be split off and repressed with defensive structures around it in object relations. So defense no longer is something in relation to an internal conflict that gets enacted out, but it's a relational maneuver. And he's particularly focused on splitting, denial, and idealization, which are all efforts to preserve ties to needed but injurious objects. Aggression then is largely something that's embedded in an anti-libidinal ego and rejecting object system, or the internal saboteur dynamic internally. And he then defines for him, maturity is reaching a point at which there's a capacity for real relationships that are outside of kind of a repressed, internalized, out of conscious awareness structure of the anti-libidinal and libidinal ego and anti-libidinal and libidinal object. Those who take up, and by the way, he doesn't, whereas he has a overall framework in metapsychology, he does not offer much in his papers around technique. Whereas Winnicott does offer quite a bit around technique, around particular problems that come up outside of metapsychology. Those who have written about Fairbairn afterwards talk a lot about the ways in which these different split ego and self-representations that are internalized get enacted in the transference. And the clinical technique is to listen and locate yourself in relation to it and which part of the patient's ego structure you're in conversation with. This is where David Solani's work comes in. It's helpful, but not very extensive. So he then, at the end of his writing, has a synopsis, which ties all these things together. Okay. Hey, this is pretty okay. Winnicott in 30 minutes, Guntrip in 19, or Fairbairn in 19 minutes, Guntrip in 11 minutes. Can it be done? We can talk. So Guntrip, do you know why Guntrip's a good person to come to after the first two? This is a pop quiz. Guntrip was analyzed by both Fairbairn and Winnicott. And he has a paper about it, which is a wonderful paper. But he's kind of the intellectual home between the two. What Guntrip is probably most known for is writing about schizoid phenomena and schizoid patients, more aligned with the way that we use that word. For Fairbairn, it was schizoid about splits. For Guntrip, it's about internal retreat. So Guntrip was born in London in 1901, raised in a modest household. His early educational experiences reflected an interest in both religion and human nature. And in the 1920s, he studied theology and psychology at the University of London. He trained as a congregational minister and actually served as a minister for several years while exploring the psychological dimensions of spirituality and pastoral care. In his pastoral counseling, he was realizing he felt more and more called to be doing more intensive psychological work. And in the 30s, he became more definitively interested in psychoanalytic ideas. Particularly, he was interested in forensic and those who emphasized empathy and the therapeutic relationship above drive theory, metapsychology. So this was his entrance into thinking about becoming more a psychotherapist rather than pastoral counselor. In the 40s, he joined the British Psychological Society and began his first analysis, which was with Fairbairn, and later pursued a second analysis with Winnicott. His paper basically, and it's interesting, if you read Fairbairn, it's highly technical, metapsychological. If you read Winnicott, it's so experience near and holding. His assessment of the two was Winnicott was the much more dogmatic and traditional, and Fairbairn was the much more related, interpersonal, and free, and that neither analysis were entirely successful for him. But it's a very interesting paper in which he contrasts the thinking, how it influenced his theorizing, but also his experience. And he does it near the end of his career, I think, feeling less vulnerable to kind of opening up about that sort of experience. But I think it's a gift of the paper, worth reading. So although he became later a member of the Psychoanalytical Society, he never completed full analytic training. And this was in part due to his critical stance towards orthodoxy. He kind of refused to go through the hoops. At the time of his death in 1975, though, he was recognized as one of the major contributors of the British Middle School, even outside of his status as not someone who was an analyst by those standards. So his major works, and he's actually written quite a bit, Personality Structure and Human Interaction, Schizoid Phenomena, Object Relations in the Self, Psychoanalytic Theory, Therapy in the Self, and then his paper, My Experience of Analysis with Fairbairn and Winnicott, subtitle, How Complete a Result Does Psychoanalytic Therapy Achieve? It's a great subtitle paper. So early on, his earliest influences were in relation to his first training analysis with Fairbairn. And he, in a way very similar to Fairbairn, this should sound similar, moved from drive theory to a relational object-seeking motivation for human development. And he takes this view up that the psyche is organized around relations to internal, external objects and not tension discharge. But he starts to focus on what he calls ego weakness and dependence as a consequence of traumatic, unsatisfying relationships. He's less about the splits that Fairbairn writes about in his metapsychology and starts to think about, in particular, what later he calls the regressed ego. So his early clinical stance is that a human, reliable therapeutic relationship matters as much as interpretation in terms of the holding of an experience of someone with ego weakness and dependency needs in the analytic treatment as it's unfolding. He then starts to build his own system for thinking about this in the 60s. And he has not quite as full a metapsychology as Fairbairn, but his own kind of fuller model of thinking about it. So he recasts neurosis and psychosis in terms of disruptive object ties and defensive internalizations, which echoes Fairbairn, but extends it towards self-psychology vocabulary, not self-psychology in the Cahutian sense, but self-experience. He interchangeably uses the word self and ego in a lot of his writing. He emphasizes the move towards mature dependence, which is healthy relatedness versus pseudo-independence. And he reinterprets transference as a living relationship with the therapist rather than a drive derivative. Many people were doing this by that time. This is not unique to Guntrip. His primary argument, though, is that technique has to address ego fragility in those who are sensitive to rejection and have a need for just a steadying contact. This is most represented in his paper on personality structure and human interaction. In Schizoid Phenomena The Self, he dives more into schizoid dynamics and talks about a spectrum that he maps out, ranging from withdrawal, which is on the least kind of schizoid end, to detachment, a living deadness, depersonalization, and a powerful inner world with minimal outer engagement, which he calls the regressed ego. He clarifies a self versus ego distinction where the self is the experiential core that can retreat, whereas a regressed ego or trans self is where early object ties are rejecting or engulfing. He elaborates the internal saboteur pattern akin to Fairbairn's anti-libidinal, but his is more about a sense of deadness and retreat from the world. He emphasizes that on reliability, warmth, and non-intrusiveness to coax the withdrawn self back into relatedness in the therapeutic dyad. So two concepts I want to outline, and then I'll be very near to stopping. Two things he talks about. One is the regressed ego, and the other is what he calls the in and out program. The regressed ego or what he sometimes refers to as the withdrawn self or the inner self, refers to the part of a personality that has retreated from external reality relationships into the inner world in response to early relational trauma, particularly rejection, neglect, or emotional engulfment. It is not destroyed, this part of the self, or lost, but it's cut off and hidden. And in fact, this regression of the ego inwards is a preservative, a self-preservative act. The idea is that the regressed ego holds some true living core of the self, which has gone into psychic retreat to protect itself from injury. And this is the deepest level of withdrawal in the schizoid organization. It creates, as part of this effort to survive, a split between the outer ego, which can look like something functioning adaptively, compliant, and intellectualized. Our patients these days, I think in part informed by the language around autism, but I think they use it more generally, talk about masking. I mean, one way to think about that is in terms of kind of this compliant outer ego self, whereas the regressed ego is the living, feeling self that isn't hiding. In relation to this, he talks about the in and out program, which is a repetitive defensive cycle in which the schizoid individual, at whatever level of withdrawal they're in, alternates between going inward, which is a retreat into the inner world to preserve the self from intrusion, engulfment, or rejection, and going out, which is a cautious re-engagement with external reality or relationships, searching for contact, validation, or love. And it's the behavioral or emotional expression of the regressed ego's dilemma, namely, I need relationships to feel alive, but they threaten my existence. So I go in and out of them. Hence the in and out program. Lastly, his papers towards the end are on regression technique and some of his later integrations, where he normalizes in the therapeutic encounter regression to dependence. This is where Winnicott's influence later on in his second analysis comes in. Is a necessary part of repair, not a failure, when the patient finally meets a reliable other and can regress. It centers treatment around reviving the living self rather than interpreting defenses. And he's influenced a lot in Winnicott's writing on play and potential space in this. And then this all gets kind of a capstone in his 75 paper on his experiences in his own analysis. I can't believe I still, oh, there it goes. Can't believe I still have a voice. So, I mean, hopefully it goes without saying, I have not done justice to any of these three individuals, but have tried to highlight some of the historical context in which their ideas developed, both the tensions within the British psychoanalytical, their independent thought as the middle school in between the two warring camps, but also, boy, I hope you see some of us in this work and some of how we integrate it into our work. And in fact, in ways I think extend and potentially elaborate it in our work with our patients, because they are a masterclass in all of these things. So some of the things I would highlight, and then I'm going to be so relieved to shut up and talk. But some of the things that I would highlight are, one, the spirit of independent thought and integration are so alive in this place. It's one of the joys of working here is that people can think independently, but also as an act of integration. One of the things that the British middle school stood for at its best was not saying we don't care about Freud's ideas, we don't care about Klein's ideas, but to take from them and to integrate them and to nuance them and to challenge them, to bring things in. Another part is an appreciation for both the intrapsychic and the environmental. I mean, we are so attuned to the real environment of our patients. This is, I mean, in part Erickson's influence on our work, but also in the bones of the place in the therapeutic community and watching our patients take up their lives in engagement with others, and also in the work we do with families. We're not just treating someone's internal objects, we're working with their lives and the people in it. There's also a developmental lens, which was at the heart of the conflict in the controversial discussions, but is also, if you look at the middle school, is disproportionately represented by people who were invested in child work and child development and child analysis and carrying that into work with adults. There's a focus on real relationships and also an appreciation for regression and the possible ways to understand this in treatment, which is often a thing that we talk about and come up against. And then there's 30 other things we can list, but thank God, I'm going to be quiet now and I'm going to open it up for discussion.